Not since 1981, with the attempt on the life of Ronald Reagan, have we seen a president or former president so close to being killed by an assassin. Saturday's attempt on the life of Donald Trump was shocking. It was horrifying, and it's rightly been condemned across the political spectrum in America. We don't yet know the motive of the shooter, but it is easy for many people to wonder if this is just one more contribution to the rising level of political violence in America, not seen really since the 1960s. What has brought us to this point, politically and culturally? Is there anything that can get us out? Well, welcome to New Ideal Live, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. My name is Ben Bayer. With me are my colleagues, Elan Journo and Onkar Ghate. We are going to talk about some of those questions today. And this is a big topic that has engulfed the discourse of the nation for the last few days. So especially because it's a big and important topic, will likely go longer than we usually do today, and we will plan to take more questions than we usually do. So if you have them, please feel free to send them in using the super chat feature or just the regular chat feature in YouTube, especially if you're watching on YouTube. So Onkar, Elan, I think it should go without saying that political assassination in a free country is an abomination that should be condemned, should be prevented. Maybe most people realize that's obvious, but just in case they don't, what can we say to explain why this is so important to do? Onkar?
Yeah, you can look at it in two ways. So you can look at it broadly as an issue of the rule of law, but putting that more simply, it's no individual citizen has the right to take the law into their own hands. I don't like a person, and it doesn't matter. That's why it's an assassination. If it's for political reasons, if it's you don't like your neighbor and you kill them, you don't have the right to resort to force, to physical force, to settle disputes with people. Part of what a civilized country is, and what it means, to say it's civilized, is it has genuine rule of law, is that the use of force is put under control of the government, so that if you have a dispute with your neighbor, you might try to resolve it just amicably. If you can't, you might sue your neighbor for something. His fence is actually on your property and he won't move it. There's mechanisms by which to address disagreements and disputes that aren't taking force into one's own hands and deciding it, like, I don't like what he's doing, so I'm going to beat him up or I'm going to kill him. And the same is true for political candidates and political disagreements. If you don't like a candidate, you can vote against him. You can support other candidates. You can enter the race politically, whether it's local, state, or federal positions. So there's all kinds of mechanisms by which we resolve disagreements and disputes that are explicitly not taking the use of force into your own hands. And so for anybody who's on the side of civilization, this kind of act should be seen as barbaric and out of bounds. And period. Like, that's the end of the analysis in a certain way. The moment someone thinks that they can wield force unsupervised by law and by government, they can just take the force into their own hands, they should be condemned. And it doesn't matter if you think what you think of their reasons for it. The moment they resort to force, that should be the end of the analysis, in terms of they're definitely in the wrong, and like way in the wrong.
And it's worth pointing out that there's at least some reason to think that this was an attitude that Ayn Rand herself once expressed. Put up on the screen passage here taken from an interview that was done with an acquaintance of hers about her reaction to the Kennedy assassination. I'll just read it. According to Frederick Feingersh, who was interviewed back in 1999, he said, "On the day President Kennedy died, that evening I was at a lecture that she gave, in the question and answer period, somebody said something like, "You never liked President Kennedy, so his death is nothing to grieve about." She got terribly upset about that remark and said, quote, "This is America. This is not the way we do away with presidents. We do away with them in a very civilized manner. We vote. We do not kill people."
I just want to chime in on that, Ben, and say two things. One, this is from the book 100 Voices, An Oral History of Ayn Rand. Oral history is its primary source material, but it's also subject to a lot of the distortions that can arise from memory. And so we have to keep that in mind. It's not clear how accurate this remembrance is. If it is accurate, then I definitely agree with that perspective, that, as Onkar was saying earlier, this is a hallmark of a civilized society, that you move political power peacefully, and nobody in a society is permitted or condoned to take the law into their own hands for any reason. And the other point I would raise here is that, to go to your point earlier, Ben, about this goes without saying, unfortunately, and I think this is why we have to have such a long discussion today, it isn't going without saying. There are people, a minority of people who are anti-Trump and would have liked the bullet to go in a few millimeters in the opposite direction and harm him. And there are people who are for Trump and who see this as who are inventing all kinds of stories about how this came about. And there's a lot to say about how people are processing this event. And as you said as well, that it's understandable that people think of it as possibly an example of political violence. But the fact that we have this climate is a significant issue. And I think the injection of this arbitrary use of force is a significant, really scary development. But again, it's not, I don't think it should be seen in isolation. That's an important feature here.
So in light of some of those comments about why political assassination, like any kind of killing of innocent civilians, is so horrific, there's been a lot of commentary on the Secret Service's failure to prevent this in the first place. But what should be our view of them, generally speaking, in light of this kind of circumstance? And do they deserve the kind of scrutiny that they're currently getting, given the importance of preventing assassinations?
I think the answer is, in the long run, yes, but one's first reaction shouldn't be to target the Secret Service and say they're incompetent, and certainly not there was some kind of conspiracy to allow to look the other way and allow this to happen. I have the same reaction in regard to 9/11. One might think that for 9/11 there were intelligence and military failures leading up to 9/11, but the idea that that's going to be your primary focus right after 9/11 of like what did people screw up, rather than your focus is on the perpetrator of the attack and trying to figure out, was he a lone actor, or was he involved? Could this happen again? Is he part of some kind of movement or group? And so, that's all the focus. That's what the focus should be, and they should gain our support in doing that. And more broadly, they should gain our support in the fact that they're doing a very difficult and important job of protecting our political figures. And just and it's not all. Don't politicize everything. You brought up Reagan's. The attempt on Reagan's life, that was not, it didn't seem, at least from what had came out afterwards, politically motivated. It was the attempted assassin. It was the infatuated, I think, with Jodie Foster, and it was something about trying to impress her to become famous and so. But that's still, their life is on the line when they face somebody like that. And the idea that your first response is to criticize them or go after, rather than to be appreciative of the fact that there are these people, and that they shot the guy who was taking shots and I mean hit Trump and killed somebody else, and so, that's, I think, one's first reaction should be.
And I want to just chime in again, Ben, and say, I'm sure we'll get to this later in the conversation, but there's a really important issue here, which is the rush to analyze their performance. Did they fail? Did they not fail? What did they know? What did they not know? And it's understandable, but it's premature. And the important issue here is to respect the need of objectivity. It takes a lot of work to reconstruct what went wrong. And this is, I'm open to the fact that they did things wrong and that they maybe fell down on the job. I don't know. And that's the point. It's too soon to form a view. And forming a view in a rush, as many people are eager to do, and worse than that is embracing conspiracy theories or conspiracy fantasies at this point. I think that is really telling about the quality of people's thinking or non-thinking. And I think it speaks to the kind of culture that we are in and the sort of the tribal mentality that is surfacing or becoming more salient in many people's experiences.
Yeah, and I think that last point, Elan, is a good segue to the next big issue we wanted to talk about, which is that, so there's a question, why even comment on this if it should go without saying that assassinations are terrible? Why comment? Now, you already spoke to that somewhat by saying, well, it's not going without saying for some people, and that needs comment. But there is a wider cultural issue here, and the fact that people are so ready to see this as politically motivated, as it might turn out to be, is a sign that we've seen this rising tide of political violence in the last few years. And I mean, in my view, I often think about how are we doing compared to the 60s. I still don't think we're as bad as it was in the 60s and early 70s, but it's like we're getting there. And we've commented on other instances of political violence, and I think we need to comment on this one too and try to understand where it's coming from and hold responsible anyone or anything that's contributing to it. And so there has been this rising tide of political violence, and I think it's been coming from both sides of the political spectrum, and we should talk about it. We should talk about how it's coming from both sides. Elan, Onkar, do you want to jump in to characterize that?
Well, I want to say one thing that's it's going back a little bit, but it's connecting to this issue because you're bringing up the 60s and the 70s and the kind of political violence that existed then. We talked about Ayn Rand, what she said or is purported to have said about the Kennedy assassination. So that's in the 60s. It's worth pointing out, I think, because it's relevant to people's processing it in regard to Trump. Ayn Rand was I was going to say a critic of John F. Kennedy, but that's putting it somewhat mildly. She thought that he is moving the country away from freedom towards a kind of authoritarian fascism. That was her view of Kennedy and Kennedy's administration. And that in her mind, I think this is part, like I can imagine she was horrified by somebody thinking, yeah, so like what's the big deal that he was assassinated? As though that is somehow capturing her view. And you can simultaneously have a view of a political figure or a political party that it's moving the country away from freedom and think that that does not justify at all, does not mitigate at all the use of political violence in order to try to prevent that person from gaining power. And part of the reason Ayn Rand was so active in regard to politics, I think, and thought people in general, like citizens, you should be active because it matters who gets into power and what they do. And it's true that you can have candidates who are moving, or trying to, or actually moving the country in a bad direction towards less freedom. And you have the ability to advocate against that, speak against that, write against that, organize politically, and then vote. And that's what you have to do, and you should do against candidates that you oppose. So you can simultaneously be radically opposed to a candidate and think that any use of political violence is completely out of bounds and is to be condemned. And I think that's what you get from her and why she spent a lot of time advising people about how to think about political candidates, how to vote, how to think about the parties, because that's what she expected them to do, not to go out and reach for a gun.
So to your point, Ben, about the climate that we are seeing, and just to connect it to what Onkar was bringing up, I think of this climate, and I'll give some examples of what constitutes this trend or pattern. It's the abandonment of the mind as the tool for solving disputes, of using persuasion. It's the recourse to jungle force. It's really nothing more than that, and that is an essential to understanding why it's so evil. It's you're breaking from civilized discourse, from civilization, which is, it's such an achievement that we have societies where there's a dispute, there are objective ways to resolve it without coming to blows. That is just, it's a peak in human development that people just don't appreciate, because most of human history has not looked like that. And that's why the rise of political violence with this climate it's a retrogression, and it needs to be seen as a retrogression. So what are some examples we're talking about? What do we say when, what are we pointing to in the world? So just take some recent examples. Stop Oil. And they go and vandalize museums, and they spray paint on buildings, and they try to slash paintings, and it looks like a stunt, but that is violence. That is destroying property. That is disturbing people's enjoyment of an art museum or their ability to get into a building. Well, think during COVID, following the murder of George Floyd, there were riots in cities across the United States, the Black Lives Matter protests. And we've talked about that at length on this podcast over the years. But those, as much as they were varied, many of them were riots. There's no way around that. The people's property, their shops, their businesses were ransacked. They were looted. They were destroyed. People's livelihoods were decimated. That is an example of taking force into the streets in the name of some political goal. And even more recently than that, we've talked about the pro-Hamas campus encampments and the protests in the streets in New York and other major cities around the United States and across Europe. We've seen this too. And we're not talking about peaceful protests. We're talking about people ripping down American flags, putting up Palestinian flags, and chanting for the death of Jews, chanting for tearing America down, and all the coded slogans and the shibboleths of from the river to the sea. That is an exterminationist slogan. That is a threat. That is in many cases, it's a threat to the people on campus. So that is, and I think threats are a kind of force. And so when you see that, and that's happening at elite campuses, at Columbia, it's happening at many, many universities around the country, that is part of the climate that we're talking about. And I think one thing that is important to flag here is, I've given examples from the last 10, 15 years. You can go even further back to the anti-globalization protests in the 1990s, where there were people going to protest the fact of economic integration across the world and the growth of businesses around the world. So there's just a number of these that have grown over the years. And what I would emphasize in this is, people take up arms and they commit violent acts, and they violate the rights of others a lot, all the time. And they do it for political reasons all the time, and a lot in different places. It has no place in the United States, has no place in a free society. But what is the most alarming feature of this is the reactions to it, and the fact that it's in some places condoned, in other places encouraged, and just the idea that it's become more accepted and normalized. I think that's part of what is making this a climate, because the more it happens and the more it's accepted, the more it becomes something that is a feature of our society. It's harder to get rid of. And I think that's part of why it's hard to turn around, but it's important to see that it's layered upon layered reactions and encouraged behavior over time.
Elan, you gave a number of examples of political violence emanating from the left in the last few years. And it's important to note, of course, there's not yet any reason to think Trump's shooter was on the left. He's actually a registered Republican. But there's also a lot of violence coming from the right. And it's hard to see exactly why a Republican would want to shoot Trump. But Onkar, do you have comments on right-wing political violence?
Yes, and so there's a way in which you can think of this as left-right, but it's an error, I think, to think of it like that. So what's good about the fact that there's been, I think you put it something like this, Ben, that across the political spectrum, there's been condemnation of this attempted assassination of Trump. What that means is, if it's sincere, what it means, it doesn't matter what this person's motive was and what their cause is, and whether I think that cause is good or not. You cannot use violence to try to, and force to try to advance that cause. And so what of the ones that Elan brought up, you can think of them on the left, but what that means, so BLM, the Stop Oil, but what that means is there's people who think, yeah, I agree with that cause. I want us to use way less fossil fuels. I think blacks are being unjustly treated by the police. And that cause then justify, I can use force, or I'll look the other way, or not severely criticize people when they take up arms in the name of that cause, because I'm sympathetic to the cause. That's what is wrong. And it does, the idea that a cause can justify the use of force, you're on the side of the use of force and against civilization if you think that. And the fact is that across the political spectrum, but it's really deeper than the political spectrum, it's too many people now think the way to resolve problems is to resort to force. And when it's people I don't like, I'll call them out and condemn them for using force. But when it's people I like and I think are on my side, then I'll be apologetic, I'll look the other way. And two of the major things of the that would be put on the right, you can think of what happened under the Trump administration and the reaction to it. And it's in both, you can see there's an internal disagreement that gets resolved in a certain way. And I think it gets resolved in being pro the use of force. So early in Trump's presidency, there was Charlottesville. And if you followed what happened in Charlottesville in real time, chronologically, it went from Friday into Sunday. Trump gave various remarks on the Saturday. There was a statement on the Sunday, some remarks on the Monday, remarks on the Tuesday. The tendency today, when people look back on it, is to think of what he said on the Tuesday. What's much more important is what happened on Friday and Saturday. On Friday, there was speculation that this Unite the Right movement was going to march in Charlottesville. They had a permit for Saturday, but there was speculation they're going to march on Friday in an area where they don't need a permit, which was on the UVA, University of Virginia campus. And I followed this. I live in Virginia, so it was part of the local news as well. It wasn't only the national news, so it was easy to follow what was going on. And that should have been seen as real intimidation when they're carrying torches and weapons and what they were chanting. But then there were people, they marched to the Thomas Jefferson Monument, and there were counter-protesters there around the monument. And it ended up in fights. That should have been I'm against the whole conception of how people think about protest and the so-called right to protest. But when it descended into violence, that should have been the end. They should have taken away the permit for the Saturday. They eventually on Saturday declare a state of emergency, but it should have been way earlier. You should have been on the moment force is being used to try to resolve a political dispute. And here the purported dispute was about statues for the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee's statue was the paramount one. That's what should have happened. And every politician across the spectrum should have been, yeah, this is way out of bounds. And then if you had the people perpetrating it, their ideology is corrupt, and it's an ideology that will lead them to use force. There should have been outright condemnation of it. And there was some, but there wasn't from Trump. And he eventually on Saturday weighed in, and it was a mealy-mouthed statement. And many Republicans in his party called him out for it. Rubio did. Lindsey Graham did, Paul Ryan did, Mitt Romney did. A host said, look, this is way inadequate. You have to be, as president, way more condemnatory of what happened. And then, I mean, the events on Saturday were way worse. And so this was partly an internal battle in the party about, like, this is unacceptable. And now, if you look at the Republican Party, it's, oh no, don't blame Trump for anything he did in Charlottesville. There's nothing to criticize. Joe Biden's making it all up. And that is a sort of looking the other way in the use of force. And that people rightly treated, because this was early in the presidency, is this his attitude towards force? And the use of force? And what happened on January 6th had similar things. Again, you had the outright use of force by supporters of Trump. And he, for hours, couldn't come out when it's like we're watching this on TV. The people attacking the police on the Capitol, bashing in doors and windows. And for hours, he can't get on TV and call it off. And when he eventually has a press conference about it, it's, oh yeah, this election was stolen, and I understand why you're fighting, but you can't do this, and we're supposed to be peaceful, and law and order is supposed to prevent, but you're very good people, but you should go home. It was so, again, if one thinks that in comparison to the reaction to the attempted assassination on Trump, it was nothing like that condemnation of the use of force. And if you don't do that, whatever you say, you're actually helping that making, so I think, Elan, you put it as normalizing the use of force to settle political disputes. You're actually normalizing that. And that's part of what it means that we're in a environment. Like, my reaction when I heard about the attempted assassination is, unfortunately, like, it's not good to have this reaction, but it was, unfortunately, I don't find it that surprising, because the use of force to settle political disputes has become much more normalized. And in that environment, you should expect, it's not to say this particular incident is one of those, but you should just expect that force will be resorted to more often.
I just want to chime in with something, Ben, and we'll dig into this a bit more. But two quick things, and I see some questions have come in, and we'll definitely try to take as many questions as there are. So one question is about advice on voting, I think, and I just want to make a general comment about how we think of our relationship to the political scene as an organization that is a 501c3 nonprofit. So the Ayn Rand Institute is a nonprofit educational philosophical organization. Our purpose today and always is to educate people about Ayn Rand's ideas and their application. And when we talk about politics, and particularly during the election season, our goal, and it's not part of our mission, it's not something we ever try to do, is our goal is not to steer you towards a particular candidate. We don't advocate for candidates. We don't advocate against candidates or legislation. So what we're trying to do is to bring out the philosophical, moral dimensions of what is going on in the culture and what's important to think about. And in that sense, that fits our agenda as an organization, to help you think philosophically about what some of the most important events in the culture are. So I think for the person asking about advice on voting, I'm not going to be able to answer that, and that's not a question that we are aiming to answer here. That's one point I want to raise. And I think the other point, and I think this will come out as we talk more about the kind of culture that has normalized political violence, or just the use of violence to solve disagreements. I'm just curious, just to make extra clear, nothing that we're saying here should be taken to mean that Trump had it coming. I don't think that's true. I don't think you should look at him, because I think he is a victim. I don't think anyone would want, I certainly don't want harm to come to him. I think it's important to understand that this is not, the attempted assassination is not something that he deserved, not even by a mile, right? So that's important to understand. At the same time, it's important to be able to evaluate him as a political figure. And that's part of what we're saying, is that you're thinking about Charlottesville and his reaction to that. You're thinking about January 6th and his reaction to that. And there's still more to say about those. And those things need to be evaluated and criticized, even as he's recovering from this attempted assassination. And even as I don't wish, and I certainly don't want to see any more of this kind of behavior from anybody in the culture. So there's both of those things can be true at the same time. And it's important, and I wish I didn't have to say this, but I think it's important that it has to be said, because the way people process this, as we indicated earlier, criticizing Trump means you're on the side of the assassin. Or if you're for Trump, then you think he can't do wrong. And none of that is true. It's just not the right way to think about these issues. All right, so let's go back to the thread that you were developing. Ben, do you want to chime in here?
Well, I wanted to come back to Onkar and ask him a bit about what he just said about Trump and violence on the right, because, yeah, I think the reaction of some in our audience to your having said that would be to say, why bring this up when he's suddenly the victim? If it's not that you think he had it coming, why do you think it's important to point this out? Why do you think it's important to point out? And this is something that we talked about before we had the episode. Are we going to discuss this or not? And we decided it was very important to comment on ways in which Trump has encouraged or at least not discouraged this climate of violence. Why is it so important to talk about this now?
Because the basic issue, to go back to the start of what we were talking about, is, are you against, and on principle and consistently, are you against the use of violence? And I mean, many of these are violent, like that's a incredible and often swift use of force. But more broadly, are you against the use of force to settle political disagreements? And if you are, you have to be across the board on principle. And any time you see the use of force, even if it's criticized, if it's not viewed as out of bounds, as this is the descent from civilization to barbarism, then you're not actually against it. The issue requires a strong and principled stand. And anytime you see that that's not happening, you have to be deeply concerned. And so I have the same, or like essentially the same view of Charlottesville and of the BLM riots, that the way in which leading figures, so you can think of like prominent voices in our culture, gave sanction and harbor after the fact. So when they can see this has descended into riots, this has descended into force, they make excuses, they downplay it. If you remember for the BLM, of what Seattle, for I don't know how many weeks, it was anarchy in parts of the downtown, a police station taken over. And the lack of outright and forceful criticism of them from across the political spectrum was very noticeable. And anyone who views themselves as, I'm really on the side of civilization, not the barbarism, it should have disturbed you. And it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat and you think your party's doing it, it should have deeply disturbed you. And I think the same is true thinking of it as political sides of Charlottesville or January 6th. And if you don't have that view, if you can't get it, that it doesn't matter what the cause is and whether I have sympathy to it, when they're using force to try to advance the cause, I have to be 100% forcefully against it. If you're not doing that, then you're not actually against the use of force. And it's a really important issue.
So I think one of the other reasons that we wanted to talk about this today is not just because of the fact that this assassination attempt may have been another example of this rising trend of political violence that we've just been talking about. But because of the philosophical nature of what is responsible for that trend, and the way you can see the philosophical nature of the reaction to it. And what's, I think, common to both of those is that a certain kind of political tribalism. And we can talk about how that has generated this climate, how it's characteristic of the response to it. But maybe before we do that, we should also say a little something about what we mean by political tribalism. And Elan, you've written a fair amount about this. So before we talk about how it relates to the latest news item, can you lay that out for us, what we are talking about here?
My view of tribalism is informed by Ayn Rand's philosophic analysis of tribalism, and because I agree with her. I think she's identified the essential nature of it in the contemporary world, and she did that decades ago. She saw this coming in essays from many years ago. I think an important feature of tribalism is that it's the subordination of reason to commitment to the group. It's not what's true, it's what is my group telling me to do. And it's not a concern with truth, it's not a concern with facts, it's a concern with aligning yourself, conforming to what you think your group believes. And you're taking your cues from typically the group, but that often just means the leaders of the group. What this looks like is being driven by emotions. It's you belong or you don't belong. They're insiders versus outsiders. Who do we hate? Who do we keep? Who do we shun? And who are the people who are our enemies and making everything bad for us? It really puts you in a mind frame. The more fully it takes over someone's mind, being driven by emotions and not your thought, not the concern with facts and observation. And I think some of the ways in which this manifests is it's all over our political space. So think about the way people talk about we have to own the libs, or we're going to show the Republicans are wrong about some point in a gotcha kind of way. And people talk about that as point scoring. And that's one way to look at it. But more deeply, it's about exposing yourself as someone who's very loyal to the tribe and is showing the other tribe as inferior, as not worthy. And that's an important part of the dynamic in tribalism, is that it's continually an attempt to reinforce your standing versus some other group. And there's psychological dimensions to this we might get into, but it's really important to see that it's driven by that dynamic of group loyalty over truth, group loyalty over facts, and your own independent judgment. And so one other feature of this that's already come up in one respect is it's okay if our guy does it, but it's not okay if they do it. So we think about the BLM protests and the reactions to it. So I think there were people who are sympathetic to the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement who were part of the way they processed it is, we're going to downplay the wrongness of rioting and looting and destroying property and decimating people's businesses. And that's, but when January 6th happened some months later, it was how unconscionable it was that the other side was doing something at least as bad, if not worse. And so it's okay if our side does it, but not if their side does it. And this applies not just to the kind of violence we've been talking about, it applies to double standards across the board, both to political leaders and party membership and things like that. So it's this inherent double standard that you see. One way to understand it is it's commitment to your tribe and putting it above what's important, what's true and good. And I think the final thing I'll say, and I'm sure there's more to elaborate here, and I'm interested in what else you guys want to add to this. The final thing I'll say is that because this is a mindset that pushes you to behave on the basis of your emotions and reactions rather than your judgment, it disconnects you from the possibility of resolving disputes in a civilized way, which means through persuasion, through reasoning, through conversation, and trying to get other people to see the facts as you see them and to process them as you see it. And so the end point of tribalism is that you can't engage with the outside people not in your group, maybe even people in your group. you can't resolve disputes except through force, because that's the only alternative to persuasion. So there's a dynamic that pushes tribalism more and more towards that kind of, it's not really a conflict resolution, but that's the means by which conflicts are attempted to be resolved. So I think those are important features of what tribalism is and how it manifests and some of the ways in which it connects to this debate.
This last is something that I wanted to ask Onkar about in particular, about the connection between tribalism as we've just characterized it and not just failing to resolve disputes through persuasion, but the connection between tribalism and violence of the sort we've been seeing more of. Onkar, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, one aspect of what Elan was highlighting, which is very important, is if one understands tribalism as it's devoid of ideas, that's why you can't persuade. What you can persuade someone is the truth of some idea or some principle. You have arguments that you're going to establish its truth. The less and less one views one's own side, like that we have ideas and principles and arguments, the necessary consequence of that is we can't persuade other people of these. That's not how we arrived at them. It's not through arguments. It's just, well, this happens to be our tradition. Sometimes it will be put in quotes culture, but they don't mean culture as a culture of ideas and values. They mean what we've done in the past, and we're going to repeat these things and these out. So part of what outsiders means is they just don't act and they don't sound like we do. They're very different. We have to fear them. We can't understand them. We can't really communicate with them, and we certainly can't persuade them of of what's good or of what is true, because that's not how we're functioning. So that more and more a person descends from thinking of themselves as I have reasons and I have ideas for what I hold, and I can explain those to other people. The more they don't see themselves like that, is the corollary. They don't see other people functioning like that. And then it's like, how do you resolve disputes? And it's only it's my gang that's going to win or your gang that's going to win. There's no resolution of who's right. It's just who's going to hold the power. So everything becomes a power struggle. And part of what our so-called culture wars are today is not disputes about ideas. It's just disputes about who's going to get control of Congress or of the presidency so that they can ram their positions down everybody else's throat. You can't convince anybody. And the more that's the atmosphere, the more you're in a tribal atmosphere. And talking about Ayn Rand's unique understanding of tribalism, she talked often, it's a recurring theme in her writings, of how what she called a mixed economy. So when an economy is moving away from freedom and towards more statism, which means more government control over the aspects of an individual's lives, over their education, their health care, of who they can hire and who they can fire, of their retirement. I mean, if you think of all the government programs, controls, and agencies, we've moved heavily in the direction of the individual has less control over their lives, and the government and the state has more control over their lives. In that kind of atmosphere, that kind of political atmosphere or system, or it's really an anti-system in the end, of a mixed economy, you push people into gangs that the only way they can defend themselves is I need to find some group that can wield political power. So instead of you telling me I can't, on my own land, I can't cut down trees and build a farm because that would jeopardize some supposed endangered species, and I can't educate my kids in this way because the state has a certain view of how they have to be educated. The more it's like everything seems an issue of force, you push people to think, okay, so the only way I can have some control over my own life is if I'm the one wielding force, not people wielding force against me. I'm the one who is wielding force. My people are in power, can do what I want them to do. And that is, you're pushing people into gangs, into groups, into thinking, because that's what the system is. And as it devolves, it becomes more naked that that's what the system is, that it is the use of force against innocent people. And that it's one of the political causes of tribalism. And again, this cuts across the political parties and so on. That everybody in politics today, in one way or another, pushes the mixed economy, and you're pushing people into gangs. And I would single out here, to understand the tribalism and the idea that disputes are going to be settled by force. You can't underplay COVID and the government response to COVID. The idea that the government can lock us in our homes for months and months and months indicates to every citizen the enormous control that government has over their lives. Like, you can all of a sudden tell me I can't work, my business is going to crumble, I can't, and even with healthcare, all I have to be concerned with is COVID. I can't get tested in cancer screenings and so on, because that's all come to an end. That doesn't push people to think, okay, it better be my people wielding power, because when it's these other people, this is what they can do to me, and this is the kind of control they can exert over my life. And the fact that there hasn't been in the nation soul searching, and this is particularly now, to think of it politically, more on the Democratic left side of how can it be that we thought we can wield this amount of power over people's lives for this long, and on the basis on which they did, of part of what's emerged. But it was clear at the time they had not much basis for what they were doing. That's part of the thinking of how it pushes people to think, I've got to wield force. That's what politics is about. People forcing me or me forcing them. And that's what tribalism at a political level looks like. And it's that COVID is part of symptom and part of cause. Like many of these things, I think, are part symptom, part cause of a descent into tribalism politically.
And we've got a quote from Ayn Rand on this same issue that you were just talking about, Onkar, the role of the mixed economy and its relationship to tribalism, worth sharing from her lecture in 1977, Global Balkanization. She said, the political cause of tribalism's rebirth is the mixed economy, the transitional stage of the formerly civilized countries of the West on their way to the political level from which the rest of the world has never emerged, the level of permanent tribal warfare. And just to add one further thought to the line that you were developing, Onkar, it's probably worth pointing out that there was a time when there was a noticeable difference between the right and the left with regard to the issue of statism and the mixed economy, and the Republicans stood more for the free market. And that's just no longer the case. And if you look at the recent Republican National Committee's platform, there are no remnants of that old respect for the free market. So, and it's something we'll be, I think, revisiting in a future episode, I should mention. But the point is that both sides are, in one way or another, advocates of the mixed economy. Therefore, both sides are responsible for pushing people into these pressure groups. And at the end of the day, then you have a battle between two rival gangs, neither of which stand for any rational principle that would separate them.
Ben,
we should talk.
Just chime in on what was said.
Yeah.
A couple of thoughts on that. So I thought it was very helpful, Onkar, when you described COVID as both a symptom and a cause, or a reciprocal relationship there. And I think I would just take your point and underscore it, because I think that the mixed economy is exactly the same. It's sort of a macro level. It's both an effect of tribalism and it's a driver of tribalism at the same time. So in that sense, it's a vicious circle that keeps reinforcing, because as you get more people gaining pressure group power over the others, it manifests into, that's part of what I think is important in Ayn Rand's analysis of the mixed economy and of tribalism. The other thing I wanted to add to what's been said, and this is in part a response to a question that's come in, I just want to underline that in Ayn Rand's analysis of tribalism, the mixed economy is a major factor and an important one, as partly in the way I described it. Another important driver of tribalism, I think the fundamental one in my understanding, is it's not something that happened in the last 50 years. We've seen a lot of significant symptoms of it in the last 50 years. So Ben, you gave the example of how the two parties have become, and particularly the Republican Party has become less and less associated with the free market, less and less supportive of it. And at this point, I think there's no one really left who supports the free market in the Republican, given what's in the latest party platform. So we can trace those kinds of changes in the last 50 years or so, maybe even going further back. But the roots of the current expression of tribalism, what she called this balkanization of society, the splintering it into pressure groups and other kinds of ethnic groups or race identity groups, that is the culmination or the result of a long progression of eroding and attacking the human mind, reason as a faculty, as something that can reach knowledge, as something that is the means by which we live and engage with one another and resolve disputes, which is, I think, the high point of human civilization. We got to that point thanks in large part to the Enlightenment, which really put individuals and their sovereign minds at the forefront of our thinking. But most of human civilization hasn't looked like that. And what we are seeing since the Enlightenment is counter-Enlightenment philosophical trends. And that's the point I really want to put emphasis on. So Rand's analysis of tribalism is that it's ultimately a philosophical trend that you need to think about to understand what's driving it today. And there's a lot to say about that. And then just the sub point under that is it's not at all built in. So tribalism is not it's not a built-in feature of human nature. I don't think it's true. There's a lot of analyses in the last 10 years of political tribalism in America, particularly, and the accounts are its evolution. There's human nature. I don't think that's right. I think I agree with Ayn Rand, which is it's a default in choosing to use your mind. Ultimately, that's a very profound analysis, which I'm giving just the headline level description of. But that's an important part of how she is distinctive in analyzing tribalism. And I want to stress this, because if you think it's built in, there's no solution. It's inevitable. We're going to just keep descending into tribalism. But if you understand that it is within our power to be non-tribal, to be independent-minded, to use our minds and to engage with one another that way, and there's plenty of history to show that human beings can do that, and that's a positive to achieve and aspire to, then you can get out of this rut. You can get out of where we are and climb out and achieve a better kind of society. I think that's an important aspect of her philosophy. It's a matter ultimately of the power of human free will to choose a better direction, ultimately move a culture in a better direction. So I just want to make sure that that's something that we put on the table, because it's not at all the way people think of tribalism. Neither is it a recent phenomenon, nor is it something that's inevitable. There are ways to get out of
it. I think it's worth now talking a little bit about where we've seen tribalistic reactions to this latest story, the assassination attempt. Elan, earlier when you were characterizing what tribalism is, you talked about the frequent use of double standards, where something's okay for my group but not for another. And Onkar, I think you said more about that to explain where it's coming from, that the tribalistic mentality is one that's anti-ideas, it's anti-principled values. And it's worth pointing out, I think you've seen that exact same behavior in reaction to the assassination attempt, that whereas in the past, for instance, you often see, I mean, the most prominent example that comes to mind is the assassination attempt on Gabby Giffords. And there was an attempt then by the left and by the Democrats to blame her assassination on the specifically on very specific political rhetoric that I think it was Sarah Palin was using about trying to get Giffords out of office. They used a targeting metaphor, so they were trying to blame the targeting metaphor for the motives of whoever it was that tried to shoot Gabby Giffords. And you now see people on the right doing exactly the same thing. Now, it's not that rhetoric has no relationship at all to a climate of violence. We've talked about ways in which it is, but when someone digs up the fact that Joe Biden had a tweet once where he talked about targeting Trump for getting him out of office, again, a use of a metaphor, and says, as I think Laura Loomer, the right-wing journalist, did, therefore they are to blame for this assassination attempt. I mean, that's quite a stretch. And it's also quite a way of distracting from the individual responsibility of the actual shooter, who was not an automaton. We don't even have reason to think that he was mentally disturbed yet. For all we know, he's a bad guy who made a really awful, vicious choice. And he's the one who bears primary responsibility. And yet now you have the right trying to deflect from questions of individual responsibility in order to blame other people, adopting the same kind of very anti-individualistic, and I should add anti-free speech notion, which they themselves had condemned the left for doing during the Gabby Giffords controversy. I don't know if you've noticed, if either of you want to comment on that issue, or if you've noticed other cases of double standards in reaction to this latest news.
I have a couple of quick observations to offer, and I'm interested in your perspective, Onkar. So J.D. Vance, who had just been picked to be the running mate for Donald Trump, put out a tweet over the weekend right after the assassination attempt along the, I don't have the words exactly in front of me, but along the lines of, it's the rhetoric that we've been seeing from the left that's led to this attack, basically. So the demonization of Trump and the hatred for him fomented by the opponents. And there's a very strong narrative that's come out now, which is that this has been going on for so long. What do you expect? So, and it's entirely directed towards opponents of Trump. But that's just not at all accurate, because if you rewind, you can find as bad, if not worse, tweets and commentary against Biden from people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. And there's a question of how seriously you have to take it, but unfortunately she is in government and she is an elected official and she has a lot of attention. So people are complaining about, a few months ago, there's a cover of a magazine, the National, the New Republic, which had a picture of Trump as if he was Hitler. They modified it to make it look, and the idea is that he's a fascist. Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene in 2022 likened Biden to Hitler, and not in an illusion, not in an image. She literally said, he's Nazi Joe, has to go. So the idea that this is only coming from one side and that it's okay for our side to do it, but it's not okay for them to do it, that is really just another symptom of what we've been talking about, this double standard perspective, which I hesitate to call it a double standard, because it's not as if there's a standard that they're not really living up to. It's calling other people out for something that you yourself do, but you accept as, you don't even think it's a problem on your side because it serves your goals, and you're not concerned with whether something's true or right. You're just concerned with what supports your tribe. And I think that's all over the place. And unfortunately, it's true that this kind of rhetoric, this kind of language is contributive. I don't think it's the exclusive causal factor for the kinds of violence we're seeing, but I think it is definitely contributive. And it's not at all localized to one tribe versus the other. And I think that's an important point to make, because as you were saying earlier, Onkar and Ben, there is no conception of what is wrong about violence as a principle and as a consistent position. And that's what we're seeing I think in the way in which people are bringing up the accounts and the blaming of sort of heated rhetoric around the elections.
Let me say two things. One about the issue of double standards, and then something about what one can do as an individual and some of the questions I think one should ask oneself. So I agree with you that it's being charitable to call it a double standard, because what that means is the person that at its best, what it means is the person wants to live up to a standard and isn't, and you're calling them out. Like, that's a double standard, and on the expectation that it will bother them. Like, really? Like, it's a double standard. But I'm trying to uphold this idea or this principle, and you're saying I'm doing it inconsistently, and it would bother them. When it doesn't bother them when they point it out, then it is, to call it a double standard, it's charitable because it suggests they're trying to live up to an idea or a principle, and they're failing, and it would bother them that they're failing. That we're in a tribal age, it's, when I talk to people about some of these issues, I find it stunning how they don't care at all. That it like, if you had a view that of a principle, we're trying to have a principled view, it'd be, yeah, I don't know how to square these two things. But their processing of it is just, yeah, but it's the other side doing it. And so that it's in a totally different category than if we do it. And that's a tribal processing, not of trying to have a principled perspective. And the amount of conversations I've had with people where it's BLM is bad, but January 6th, they'll make all kinds of excuses. They'll rewrite what happened. I mean, that was an episode, again, that many Republicans criticized Trump, and now they've either left the party or fallen in line. And so that whole episode is being rewritten. And that a person, it will be, they can't hold that, isn't there some similarity between these two? Because in their mind, but it's the other side. So there is no similarity. And that's when you're in two different, it's the other tribe. And so it's totally different, unintelligible, but bad. And I have to fear it, I have to stop it. And that's tribal. And so one of the most important questions somebody can ask themselves in political debates is, am I really trying to figure out what's true? Am I really trying to figure out what actually happened on January 6th? Or what were the nature of the BLM protests? What actually happened in Seattle? It's a whitewashing to say, oh, they were mostly peaceful, the protests. What about the ones that weren't? And what was done about them? What was said about them? How were they possible that they happened? And you have to really be thinking, and you have to ask yourself, am I trying to reach what I think is a true conclusion, or am I trying to get to a conclusion that I'll find emotionally satisfying? So, and once that I've got that, I stop, and that's it. And if you're doing the second, you've succumbed likely to the tribal atmosphere. And there's a lot you can do if you ask and be honest with yourself. Am I really trying to figure out what's true here? And then in that context, double standards will really bother you, because it's yeah, I can't integrate these things. It doesn't make sense. Shouldn't I be saying something similar? If I'm outraged by the BLM, shouldn't I be outraged by January 6th as well?
I just want to add one other thought to this, if I can just jump in. There's many dimensions to the way in which people succumb to tribal thinking without fully recognizing it. I think that's part of what I take from your comment, is just to notice that that's happening, and to ask yourself, what's the final motivation here? Am I trying to understand the truth and figure it out, or am I just going with something that's tribally emotional, satisfying? I think the other kind of thing that I've seen is, so I mean, there's definitely two quick things. One is that there's exactly the same phenomena with the BLM protests as there is with January 6th. So the January 6th, that's an insurrection. It's gonna topple the republic. These people all need to be thrown in jail forever and ever and ever. And I think many of them deserve to be in jail. And I think it was a fundamentally alarming development. But you can't hold that view. And then, as you were pointing out by allusion, the BLM was mostly peaceful. And how could you be objective? There's just normal people coming out of their homes in reaction to a fundamental injustice. Well, that some of them might have been. I don't think that's uniformly true. And that kind of mirroring it's really important to see that that's happening in both directions. And then the second quick point in relation to this, the other kind of dimension of tribal thinking is the idea that if you're critical of Trump, you must be for Biden. And if you're critical of Biden, then you must be for Trump. And that's just not even remotely true. That's not even logically true. There's many other options. Not that I'm here to talk about the other options, but that's just not the right way to think of it. But if your reaction to, oh, this person is critical of Trump, they must be in Biden's camp. They must be just pushing for the Democratic agenda. Why is that your immediate reaction? Why is that your assumption? Why are you thinking in those ways? That isn't really being concerned what the person in front of you is telling you. What are the facts they're trying to present you with? What's the conclusion they're arguing for? If your immediate reaction is to put them in the other pigeonhole because they're not saying what you expect them to say, they're not saying the things you're familiar with, they're comfortable with, that is a question to ask yourself. Are you succumbing to tribal thinking? And if you notice it happening very immediately, are you actually thinking? Or is this just an emotional reaction that you're treating as if you're actually thinking? And that's true for in both directions. I think there's a lot that individuals should be orienting themselves to in how they think about these issues so that they don't become part of this climate. And that's sort of another perspective on what you're saying, which is step outside of this climate. It's not good for you. It's not healthy for your thinking. And it's not going to lead you to better politics. It's not going to lead you to a better country. You need to embrace what it means to be an individual who's independent minded and not succumb to this toxic mindset.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about following up on something Onkar said about the connection between the tribalistic mindset and not caring about what's true. To me, the most, I guess, eloquent expression of the intensity of the tribalism in the reaction to this assassination attempt is the torrent of conspiracism that we've seen pouring out of both sides of the political spectrum. And somebody, Daniel, asked us a super chat question about this, so I definitely wanted to comment on it. What's especially interesting to me in this case, and it comes from morbid curiosity, in part in my case, that is how rapidly the conspiracy theories poured forth, and how both sides of the spectrum engaged in them on the basis of the same completely impoverished amount of evidence. The New York Times ran a story the other day documenting how long it took for the first conspiracist claims to pop up on social media after the first news of the shooting, when we knew almost nothing about what was happening, hardly even that there was even a shooting. It was 4 minutes. 4 minutes. And then only 30 minutes after that did Laura Loomer, a prominent journalist with 1 million followers, start alleging that Biden was somehow responsible for having ordered this shooting. But it's on both sides. The right has been claiming that it was some kind of inside job by the Biden administration or the Secret Service to knock Trump out of the race. The left has been arguing that the whole thing was staged, that Trump was never really in any danger, that it was all done just to boost his image as though he needed it after the last few weeks. The thing to notice is the utter lack of evidence. How could there be time to gather any evidence if the news has only just come out? And the manufacturing of apparent evidence to make it look like there's thinking going on when in fact there isn't really. Both sides would point to the fact that this guy was able to get up on the roof, and how could that have happened? It must have been that somebody let it happen. And I mean, that's just a complete non sequitur. There's no actual thinking going on there. There's dozens of reasons why the Secret Service might have failed innocently to catch him, and no reason at all to think that is any evidence of a conspiracy. And so what's interesting about it to me is, in the absence of evidence, the fact that you have both sides of the political spectrum glomming onto a theory, it really brings out the tribalistic element of it, because they're in effect engaging in political wishful thinking. They really want it to be the case that it was Biden who did this, because then they can blame it on him and score political points. They really want it to be the case that Trump faked it, because then they can blame him for staging this just as a propaganda measure. It's entirely driven by their imagination, by their wishful thinking, and by their tribal loyalty, by their desire to be on the side of the good guys and against the bad guys. And neither of them have any basis in evidence for their claim. And then to use this thinking and to weaponize it so rapidly and massively on social media so soon after the fact, when we talk about the way in which tribalism is conducive to a climate of violence, well, I mean, this is one of the ways that it does it. This is one of the ways that it does it, by allowing emotions rather than evidence to rule the day in discourse. And not only that, but in a way where you're now saying it's not just that the other side is bad and we're doing everything we can to oppose the other side, but also the other side is planning in secret, not just to undertake nefarious acts, but even to kill presidential candidates. I mean, when more and more people believe that, they see the other side as this a completely demonic power. Well, it's little wonder that there's a kind of cycle of violence that continues to be perpetuated. Onkar Elan, I wonder if you have any further thoughts or comments on the conspiracist aspect of this tribalistic reaction.
Yeah, two further ways in which it connects to the tribalism. It's sort of implicit in what you've said, but both you can think of as what tribalism means is the absence of ideas and of principles. That's a very hard state in which to live. And in a modern civilized world, to be stripped of ideas and principles that can help you make sense of the world, you feel at sea. And what conspiracism and these kinds of fantasies, part of what they do is they give the semblance of understanding and the semblance of explanation and control. That I'm not out of control and the people around me aren't out of control. I've got an explanation of why things are happening. And so it's the semblance of an idea or of a theory, but it's devoid from evidence. And it's devoid most of the time from any kind of consistency or full logic. When you try to trace out, it doesn't make any sense that like simultaneously Biden is close to senile, but he's plotting these master plots and things like there's so many things that don't make sense, but it's just a semblance of thinking. And what they project, then it's not the other side might be gaining power because they've convinced people of anything. So the conspiracy that it's a conspiracy is always some nefarious thing that people have wielded power. And part of that, what makes it seem like you could use force, if we just eliminated those people, that would solve things, because there's not ideas that you have to address and counter and so on. It's just people. And that's also part of how the tribalists look. It's the other side is a bunch of people plotting against me in some kind of way. And I have to eliminate the people, not fight the ideas that they're advocating. And so that conspiracism always goes with tribalism. I think in any modern, like when we're talking about tribalism in a modern environment, so when we're talking about collapse from civilization, I think they always go together.
One interesting historical anecdote to add to that, Onkar, is a one of Ayn Rand's essays analyzing the phenomenon of tribalism is her essay, The Missing Link, which came out in, I think, 1973 or 74. And there's a portion of that essay, the original version that was published in her periodical, where she talks about the Watergate conspirators. And it's interesting how obviously they were ordered by Nixon. Nixon had a kind of conspiracy fantasy about the Democrats plotting against him. And part of the reason that he wanted to do the Watergate break-in, or that he authorized people to authorize the Watergate break-in, was to get the dirt on the Democrats who were plotting this conspiracy against him. And so in the course of thinking that there's this conspiracy on the basis of no evidence, he then engages in a conspiracy, which is that, I mean, the Watergate is the exemplar of actual conspiracies that happen in American history, which of course fails miserably on his part. And I mean, that's an example of how this kind of mindset can breed the very kind of behavior that it suspects the other side to be engaging in. Given that tribalism generally is a consequence of emotions ruling the day rather than reason and evidence, I think it's important for us to have to close our discussion by talking about ways in which trying to be more objective in one's own thinking, trying to base one's thinking on the evidence and logic rather than emotions, is the tonic that we need. If anything can get us out of this climate, that's the only thing that will do it. And I mean, there's been a lot of talk in the last few days about the need to turn down the temperature, to tone down the rhetoric. There's some understanding that there's something wrong with our mindset that's leading to this climate, but there's not been a lot of actual practical advice about how we're supposed to tone down the rhetoric or turn down the temperature, especially without actually abandoning our own values, because people still need to stand up for their values. They still need to decide how they're going to vote in this election and so forth. And so I thought we should close by talking about that. What are practical ways in which one can be more objective, more evidence-based in one's thinking? And I'll start by kicking us off with the following thoughts. There is obviously an election coming up, and we're not going to comment on or recommend one side or the other to vote for, but it is worth thinking about whether it's true that what both parties are saying about the other, that the other is the end of the world in effect, and that we're ushering in a new apocalypse for America if the other side wins. And I think there's something each side needs to consider about why that's not actually true. Like, even if you think both sides plan to implement terrible policies, which I think they do, why this doesn't mean it's the end of the world for America, not if we maintain our heads. So, for instance, to those on the right who are worried so much about Biden, I would say Biden's FBI is investigating this assassination attempt. Biden's CIA released information that there was a plot by Iran to assassinate Trump, and they, because of that, beefed up his security at this and recent events. They've now redoubled his security at the GOP convention. About politicians at the beginning about why part of what makes assassination attempts so terrible is their assault on the rule of law and their assault on the Constitution. And I think it's important to see that there is still some, at least modicum, of respect for that on both sides of the spectrum, as witnessed the fact that the Democratic administration is making efforts to find out what went wrong here and investigating to see how they can prevent it in the future. And to the left, I would say the following thing as well, because I think part of why this seems so, perhaps why some of them are tempted to wish that the bullet had gone the other way, is they see Trump as this existential threat to democracy, so forth. And they've been despondent about various losses to their side in the Supreme Court in recent weeks. Notably, the Trump v. U.S. case where the issue of presidential immunity came up. And I think we plan to do a podcast on that sometime in the next week or two. But it is important to note, if you're being objective, if you're looking at the evidence about what's actually happened in the Supreme Court, there are lots of ways in which the recent court decisions have provided a bulwark against the very kind of powerful executive power wielded by the president that the left is now worried about. The best example of this is the Chevron decision, which the left didn't like. We did a podcast about this a couple of weeks ago, about why the effect of reining in the so-called Chevron deference is to take power out of the executive branch, take it out of the administrative agencies who have no oversight whatsoever. And I think that if you apply the same kind of objectivity to even the US v. Trump decision, you'll see it doesn't give him some kind of unqualified absolute immunity to do whatever he wants to or assassinate political rivals. This is, I think, one of the things we'll talk about when we analyze this decision. But there are institutions in this country, and there's separation of powers, and that contributes to the rule of law. And if they've been remarkable, in my opinion at least, they've been remarkably resilient in the face of ever eroding standards and increasing levels of statism. And our founding fathers were amazing people who designed a system that's lasted quite a long time and has been tested by stress in ways we haven't seen before. And I'm impressed by how well it's done. And I think it's important to look at that when you're thinking about whether the end of the world is coming, in November. And if you have thoughts on that, you want to add more, Onkar Ghate.
Yeah, I'll say something on you need to be solution oriented, and you need to think about what actually are things I stand for. What are my actual values? And which of them is it proper to think that government should be enforcing these? So to think about, and so part of to get out of tribalism is to try to ascend to the level of having some actual ideas and some actual principles. So if you're worried about, say, a second Trump presidency, of what he's going to do, isn't part of the issue that the president now, the executive branch of the government, has way too much power? And if you think of it like that, then it can't be, oh, yeah, that's fine if my guy's in power, but if the other guy's in power, then all of a sudden it's a problem. That's a tribal processing of it, a principle and a perspective on ideas and values. It's a problem if the presidency has the power that the modern presidency has. And if you think of it like that, there's all kinds of things that then you can be both advocating for, but looking for candidates who, think of that as a problem. And they can be on either political side, who think, Congress has to take some power that it's ceded to the executive branch. And I mean, Ayn Rand was already talking about this is part of her analysis of Kennedy, and that we're getting an authoritarian and moving towards a kind of fascism, is that Congress has ceded so much power to the presidency. And that's a problem, and it's a problem regardless of who is the particular occupant of the office in the next year or the next 2 years or the next 4 years. This is the founding father. You brought up the founding father. They created a country, and a new country, by thinking about the principles and ideas that should govern government. And unless you're, as a citizen, willing to think about that and to think about it as in a consistent, principled way, which is what the founding fathers did, then you're actually not on the side of America. You're not trying to continue the American experiment, because we are a nation of ideas. We're not a nation of tribes. But first and foremost, to make that real in your own mind, you have to understand the ideas that led to the creation and the formation of this new form of government. And you really have to understand those. And basically, nobody today is helping you. So you have to do some of your own work. And this is part of one of the reasons to read Ayn Rand is she has, I think, the most profound understanding of what the American Revolution actually was. Like, what are the deepest ideas that led to it, on which it's grounded, and what are then the ideas that have to be resurrected, upheld, and defended if you want to be on the side of seeing the American experiment continue.
Just one final thought on my part. You raised the question of how what one individual can do in their own. I agree with what you brought out, Onkar. I would just pick up a thread from earlier in the conversation, which I think can't be overstated. This phenomenon we're talking about, the growth of tribalism, the different manifestations of it, the way it interacts with politics, and the way it fosters this climate of normalizing violence. You have to choose if you're going to be swept into it, or you're going to take conscious efforts in your own thinking every day and in every conversation to be independent and to choose to think about what's true and what's good by your own judgment, irrespective of what people who are in your community, in your network, in your professional associations, in your tribe, or however you think of it, regardless of what they say. And that is one of the deepest lessons you can take from Ayn Rand, which is it's a moral virtue to be independent, to think and put nothing above the judgment of your own mind. And ultimately, that's the tonic, or as you put it, Ben, that's the remedy for tribalism. Is the more people choose to think independently, the more they engage with the facts, the more they choose to question what they hear from even trusted sources and from authority figures and from people they respect and people who are exerting psychological pressure on them, from everybody, the more they think independently. And the more you can encourage them to do that, the more you model it yourself, the better this society will become, and the better your life will be, and the better the people around you will be, because you will choose different people to be around, because you will see through the ways in which tribalism has affected both yourself and other people. And it's important here not to think of this as a binary. That if someone has some tribal aspect in their thinking, they're untouchable, you can't deal with them. And that's not a healthy way to think of it. And it's true, there are lots of people who have mixtures, and it's profound mixtures in all sorts of different areas of their lives. But just be thoughtful about how to engage with people, even and especially people you disagree with, whatever their voting preferences are. And so there's a lot that you in your own life can, and in my view, you should be doing, because it's good for you, and it has ramifications for the people around you and for the society. That I think, if you agree with the idea of freedom and human progress and the values that Ayn Rand upholds, then that's something you should want to do and learn to become better at over time. And I think that each of us has that ability to do.
So there's a couple of super chat questions that came in that I think are worth answering before we wrap up. One about some of the political analysis we've done, one that's more about issue of civil discourse. So we got a super chat from Joe. Thank you, Joe, who asks, given that the right so often follows behind the left, and the left is by far the driver of the culture, which seems to be true here also, isn't it a mistake to treat them as if they are equally violent and equally the problem? Not quite sure if that's what we were doing, but Onkar, Elan, do you have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'll say something, and then you guys can add a few things. But I think the basic premise of the question's wrong, of thinking that what's the driver of the culture in political terms. So it's the left is more the driver of the culture than the right. The driver of the culture is the basic ideas at work. And in the end, it's philosophical ideas at work. So if you put it, and I think, Elan, I forget what the context was where you brought this up, but if you think of it as we had an enlightenment, and the end product of the Enlightenment was the creation of the United States of America. It's the last great achievement of the Enlightenment, and it's the great political achievement of the Enlightenment. And that what happened at an intellectual level is a counter-Enlightenment and the kind of rallying of counter-Enlightenment forces that were never adequately answered and opposed. I think it's only till you get Ayn Rand's philosophy do you get an answer and a response, an intellectual, rational, correct response to the counter-Enlightenment philosophy. And I think in the end, that's what she saw herself as doing, that her great opponent she thought of as Immanuel Kant. So not some political figure that she disliked, not Kennedy, even though she really disliked him. Her great opponent was Immanuel Kant because he was the leader of the counter-Enlightenment. And I think that analysis is right. And so it's not a left-right issue. It's when and to the extent that people are on the side of the counter-Enlightenment, they're anti-American. And it's true that you can think of the left as the socialist, and the flirtation even with communism dominated a lot of the 20th century, dominated a lot of the time that Ayn Rand was writing, dominated in universities. So it's true that the universities lean left politically, but that's a symptom, not the cause. They lean left politically because they turned against the Enlightenment, and part of what was essential to the Enlightenment was an individualist, pro-reason perspective on human life. That was replaced. And the consequence politically will be you'll think not in individualist terms, but collectivist terms, and you'll be in some way enamored with statism, communism, or fascism. And the reason that rose in the 20th century across the globe is because the counter-Enlightenment forces were winning. So you can think of who are the leaders of the counter-Enlightenment forces. And there's a way in which you can think of that as it's left, but that's a symptom, not the cause. And part of why Ayn Rand really turned against the right, so she was more sympathetic with the Republicans early on in her intellectual career and trying to give them ammunition, and even the conservatives, there's some kind of favorable commentary on them. The more they turned towards religion, the more it was, you're not even trying to be part of the solution. You're part of the problem. And because part of what the counter-Enlightenment forces were, and what Kant's program was, to revive religion, to regain respectability for religion against the Enlightenment that was doing away with religion. And so why didn't she support Reagan? Reagan was bringing these people back into politics, and she commented in these terms about they're taking us back to the Middle Ages, which means pre-Enlightenment, and they have to be seen as the enemy. And if you think of it like that, then it's whoever, to whatever extent they're on the side of the anti-Enlightenment, they're the problem. And the right, what would be thought of as the right in America, is so embedded with religion, and religion's the antithesis of the Enlightenment. So you can't think of it as like sort of they're hapless followers who aren't the cause of anything. They're part of the cause of the present descent into rationalism and tribalism, and they have to be seen as such and named as such.
Let's then take a look at the last question came in. This one comes from Mary Eileen. Thank you, Mary Eileen. Also with the super chat. People are often more open to a reasonable discussion one-on-one than in groups if you're polite, honest, and ask questions and don't pretend to know more than you do. Thoughts on this?
I endorse that, major parts of that, because I think it's important that if I take the question, if I understand it correctly, it's be objective in what you do and don't know, and try to engage with people in that way. And I think the additional feature of doing it one-on-one versus in groups, I think one way to think of that is it lessens the pressure on someone if they feel like they need to be conforming to a particular view. If they're on their own, they might not be that, feel like, oh, I'm going to be seen as questioning the orthodox position, or I'm going to be seen as a traitor to my group, and how could I? So I think there's important things to do in the questions setup that are right to do. One thing I will add, and this is something that's come up in other conversations, is that when trying to reach somebody, it's very unusual for one conversation to be sufficient to change their mind or even to make some headway. It often takes multiple conversations from different angles. It really depends on your motivation, but just to have a realistic view of what can be accomplished in a conversation, even when you're doing it in the most effective way. And you Ben and Onkar, you're very seasoned teachers, and you see this all the time in a classroom. It's like you need to engage with people in different ways and put a point in different ways. And I think it's useful to think of certain conversations as you're trying to reach somebody, and it's not just sharing your perspective. It's you're trying to present and uncover their assumptions and their errors and help them through that. And that's an important part of having a view of what kind of conversation you're having, as opposed to just it's a transmission of your view to them. Okay, well, that is one kind of conversation. But if your goal is to get through to them, you have to know that there's a process, and it often takes multiple iterations of that.
One thing I might add about this question is I think part of the reason why people are often more open to reasonable discussion one-on-one is that when you're having a face-to-face conversation with someone, you know who they are, and they know that you know who they are. And this is a consideration that does not often apply, for example, to online discourse. I think part of the reason that conspiracism, for example, gets so magnified in social media is there's so many people who are hiding behind anonymous or pseudonymous accounts. And if we're thinking about the question of how can we lower the temperature, how can we be more objective in our arguments with people on political subjects, if you're a participant in online discussion, and I think this question some people in the current YouTube chat might ask themselves, is the things that you're saying right now to your opponents, to the people you're commenting on, would you say these things if your actual name and identity were attached to them? Or is there something that would hold you back about that? Would you say the same things if everybody knew who was saying them, if you were accountable for them? That's a fair question worth asking yourself when you get involved in, I think, these social media discussions. So let's start to wrap up then. Thank you again for those super chat questions that came in. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. I did want to share with our audience one resource in particular that I think touches on many of the issues that we talked about today. And this is a lecture that Ayn Rand gave in 1972, A Nation's Unity, in part commenting on the McGovern campaign, but more broadly talking about the issue of political tribalism and how it connects to the mixed economy and the kind of rhetoric associated with it and the social dynamics by which people are forced into political tribes because of the mixed economy and the kind of tribalist leaders that they end up following when that happens. It's especially important to note the kind of quasi-fictional story that she tells at the beginning of that lecture about somebody who's deciding how to become politically affiliated in that kind of atmosphere. Highly recommended. We posted it earlier to the Institute's various social media accounts earlier this week, so definitely check that out. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube if you would like to get more of the same kind of thing. Click that bell to get notifications for when we go live or when we post new recordings. If you're watching a recording, please take a moment to like, to comment on it, to share it with your friends. That helps attract new viewers. Same thing if you're watching us on Facebook. And if you have questions about anything that came up today, or if you have suggestions about future episodes, or other just questions about objectivist philosophy, please send us an email to newideal@aynrand.org. We read everything that comes in, try to reply to as many of them as we can. And we will continue to be discussing issues related to recent politics in the next few weeks on this podcast. So please stay tuned for that. We will be back with more analysis of current events from an objectivist perspective. We thank you for your time today and for your support for the Institute. And thank you, Onkar and Elan, for joining me to talk about this very important issue today.